Talking about the building of the American Empire during the late 19th, early 20th century, and the discussion of the idea of imperialism. What is imperialism? Well, it is the mindset that larger countries are meant to rule over smaller countries. Imperialism began to take a stronger hold in the United States in the late 1800s. The Second Industrial Revolution had generated a desire for new markets in which American manufacturers could sell their wares. American agricultural products had long competed with other nations on the world market. Many believed that the industrial base was strong enough to compete globally now. In this age, sail power was dwindling and steam-powered ships were increasing in importance. Admiral Alfred T. Mahan called for a strong navy to protect shipments. He sparked a renaissance in how countries thought about their navies and began to modernize their fleets. Many proponents for expansion used the concept of social Darwinism to bolster their claims on foreign lands, citing the superiority of the English-speaking races over the colony's native inhabitants. Added to this was renewed European competition to colonize, this time in Asia and in the Pacific Rim. One of the motivations for colonization was to bring Christianity to these new territories. And we'll cover all of these points in this presentation today. This is parallel to what's going on during the Gilded Age. This is foreign policy that was in place as the Gilded Age passed and at the end of the Gilded Age into the beginning of the 20th century. Although much of the imperialist expansion of the United States occurred around the start of the 20th century, its roots begin further back when William Seward, Johnson's Secretary of State, secured the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. Later, Samoa allowed the United States to establish a naval base there in return for U.S. intervention to settle disputes if necessary. In 1878, the Samoans signed a treaty that allowed the U.S. to place a naval base on one of its islands. In 1875, the Hawaiian royalty entered into a trade agreement with America that allowed sugar from the islands to be imported duty-free. Then they granted the U.S. a naval base at Pearl Harbor near Honolulu. Soon American settlers began dominating the economy in Hawaii. In 1887, the Hawaiian royalty was pushed into a constitutional government, which allowed Americans more control of the island. Queen Liliuokalani tried to reclaim power from the United States' influence when she ascended to the throne in 1891, but was unsuccessful. In 1897, President William McKinley was set on annexing or taking over the islands entirely. When it became known that the Japanese were also wanting to take over the islands, McKinley sent warships to Hawaii. After failing to get a two-thirds vote in the Senate, after failing to get that necessary number of votes in the Senate to acquire Hawaii, McKinley used a joint agreement between the House and Senate to get the islands. Hawaii was annexed by the United States in the summer of 1898, and we will talk about that in class a little bit more. In the latter half of the 19th century, Cubans repeatedly revolted against their Spanish colonizers. Each time insurrection broke out, it was put down bloodily. After an uprising in 1895, the Spanish commander placed all of the Cuban revolutionaries in detention centers to prevent more people from joining the cause for independence. The dilemma in Cuba, along with many other things, was portrayed in two newspapers who competed for readers. I think we talked about this in class. Maybe we watched a video about it or two. I don't know. Maybe we did. Maybe we didn't. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal led a competition, what is known as yellow journalism. This is all like the video that I showed in class, which were fabricated stories and written to capture people's attention. President Grover Cleveland tried to protect American interests in Cuba while the newspapers overly exaggerated the Cuban crisis. When McKinley was inaugurated, the situation in Cuba became worse. On February 15, 1898, the battleship Maine was sent to Havana Harbor to protect American citizens and interests. Around the same time, a letter from the Spanish ambassador to a friend in Havana was published in American papers. It denounced McKinley as a weak politician. Well, and that ticked off McKinley, so shortly thereafter, the Maine exploded, killing 260 sailors. At the time, the explosion was blamed on a mine. A 1976 study revealed that it had actually been an internal problem. There was an explosion in the coal burner. But on these claims, however, McKinley wanted to show his strength because he didn't want anybody to think he was a weak president. McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war after all of the spewing of hate and fueling the people up and spurring them on to want to go to war through the newspapers. McKinley used the sinking of the Maine to influence Congress to declare war, and declaration of war was granted. The war only lasted 114 days, and then the Spanish offered to give McKinley their formal surrender. Much of the cause of the Spanish-American War is this tension between the United States and Spain and this uprising of the Cubans. However, the ultimate blame for the war, if blame must be levied, belongs to the American people for letting themselves be whipped into such a hostile frenzy from the press's coverage of these events. This idea of suppressing a revolution in Cuba even though the war with Spain and repressing and that fight in Cuba, it only lasted 114 days, and it didn't cause a lot of problems for the United States that way. It led to a brutal United States effort to suppress another insurrection, and this time it was in the Philippines, and it created a host of commitments in the Caribbean and the Pacific that would haunt American policymakers throughout the 20th century. So we're going to start talking about what happened in the Philippines. Because the Philippines were close to Asia, many Americans supported annexation of it as well. The proximity of the islands to China, the availability of vast quantities of natural resources, and the opportunity to Christianize its inhabitants marked it as a sure bet for colonization. Eventually, a peace treaty was ratified. Riding a wave of evangelism, hello, can't even say that. Many Protestant ministers promoted what they saw as a ripe opportunity to begin the evangelization of the world. Many unabashedly promoted the benefits of the Anglo-Saxon race and the Christian religion Protestants favored annexation, while Catholics warned that trying to convert the colonies to Protestantism would only exacerbate the problem. So you've got kind of a holy war going on in the Philippines between the Catholics and the Protestants, all wanting to convert the people, spreading Christianity throughout the world to these nations that didn't believe in Christianity. In 1899, an American soldier outside Manila fired on a group of Philippine nationalists, and a new war erupted. It took 3 years to suppress the nationalist uprising that followed. So the Philippine-American War went from 1899 until the middle of 1901, I believe. I need to check on that. We'll talk about that in class. I'm going to write that down here so I can check that. Philippine-American War. Okay, the American effort to suppress Filipino nationalism lasted 3 years, eventually involved 126,000 United States troops, and took the lives of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, most of them civilians, and 4,234 American soldiers. The nature of the war also cost the United States much of its professed benevolence. We were always the champions of freedom, the champions of compassion, and worldwide we became seen as more of a villain. It was a sordid conflict with massacres committed on both sides. And we can't really claim to be wearing the white hat during that one. There was torture from the United States that was perpetrated, some killings of civilians, some other problems that happened while we were over in the Philippines. However, we won the war, and in 1901, we acquired the Philippines. Agreeing to pay Spain $20 million, President McKinley eventually added the Philippines as a territory of the United States, and William Howard Taft was named the first governor. Later legislation would provide for greater Filipino control of the islands, culminating with their independence in 1946. Puerto Rico had been under the United States control. It was part of the deal that we acquired from Spain with that $20 million at the end of the Spanish-American War. And it was organized to provide a bastion for future European aggression and as a guarding point for a proposed canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Puerto Rico had its own constitution that could be changed if it did not conflict with the U.S. Constitution. It's the same as Guam. By 1917, Puerto Ricans were also granted United States citizenship, and in 1952, Puerto Rico became a commonwealth with its own constitution and elected officials. It has a unique status with everything of America. It's the only American commonwealth, which is Puerto Rico. I wonder if you even knew that. Cuba, taken in 1898, was also allowed to craft its own constitution, but then became limited in its ruling power when Congress passed the Platt Amendment, which allowed the U.S. to intervene when they felt it was necessary, leading to U.S. naval involvement with a new U.S. naval base, Guantanamo Bay, on the island. And you've probably heard of Guantanamo Bay. It's been in the press a lot lately. Here's a map of where the territories were where we've been fighting. These are the years that they were occupied or annexed by the United States. We got Hawaii, which isn't even on here. Yeah, it is. There it is. In 1898, the Midway Islands we occupied. Wake Island we occupied. All of these become very crucial to the war effort during the Pacific in the Pacific theater during World War II. And we acquired the Philippines in 1898, as it says on that map. So there are other rivalries for territory in Asia and especially in the Pacific. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed to Japan to force it to accept trade goods from Western markets. By 1895, Japan had defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, and taking several islands, and most important, revealing China's weakness against aggression. Acting on this new revelation, Germany, France, Russia, and Great Britain began dividing China up into markets for their expansion. Unwilling to accept a China that was divided so many ways, the United States pushed forth the open door policy, which proposed leaving China open to trade by all nations. The overall idea of free trade with all countries, or a hands-off policy, is called laissez-faire. We've talked about that in class before. Chinese nationalists, known as the Boxers, or in Chinese, Fists of Righteous Harmony, which I think is really kind of funny, rebelled against the foreign encroachments into their country. They did not want other nations influencing their people. They were eventually defeated by a joint assault of British, German, Russian, Japanese, and American forces. Theodore Roosevelt is often referred to as the first modern president, and we're going to do his bio in class this week. In fact, it can be argued that he more than any other president, shaped what Americans expect of the president today. After the Spanish-American War, he became governor of New York, and in 1900 was elected vice president with McKinley for McKinley's second term. Then in 1901, McKinley was assassinated, making Roosevelt the youngest to have ever held the office of president at 42 years old, the youngest up to that time. 6 weeks short of his 43rd birthday, Roosevelt was the youngest man ever to take charge of the White House, but he had more experience in public affairs than most and more vitality than any. And he is one of my favorite characters in history. I can't wait to talk about him with you guys. He was a beloved president of the people, known for his boundless energy and spirit of adventure, since he pushed for social reform within the country. Most of his dealings within the nation will be addressed later. In this presentation, however, we will begin discussion of his foreign policy. He once made a claim that, quote, "I am assured that I shall be able eventually to carry out my will by force when dealing with an unyielding country." However, he was really a negotiator. He was a champion negotiator, as a matter of fact. Overall, the idea behind his foreign policy can be narrowed down to the following statement: speak softly and carry a big stick. And that is the illustration of this cartoon right here, saying that he advocated the United States reaching out and having more influence over what was going on in the Western Hemisphere. Hopefully you're going to study the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. We'll talk about that in class as well. As an example of his foreign diplomacy, we're going to talk about the Panama Canal. The Spanish-American War, which started with the sinking of the Maine, prompted the need for a canal between the two seas for the U.S. Navy to get more quickly, get its ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific, because when the Maine sank, all of our ships were in the Atlantic or in the Pacific, and would have had to go all the way around South America to get to Cuba. The United States now set out to build a canal, but where should it be located? Two paths were proposed, one through Panama, the province of Colombia, or one through Nicaragua. Eventually, Panama was chosen, and when Colombia refused to go along, the Panamanians declared their independence, and Colombia was unable to respond due to U.S. warships that were, quote, conveniently in the way. The canal opened in 1914 for $10 million down and $250,000 a year. The U.S. reserved in perpetuity the use, occupation, and control of the canal zone. So that's how we got control of the Panama Canal. Excuse me. The Caribbean was ripe for armed intervention from European powers on the premise of their collecting some debt. In 1904, Roosevelt issued his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and we're going to talk about that in class, which was issued in 1823 by James Monroe, which states that if a foreign nation had an issue with a Western nation, they should come to the United States for redress of their grievances, and the United States would take care of it. In essence, Roosevelt suggested, on top of this, that the United States has, quote, international policy power, unquote, in the Western Hemisphere. This corollary became basis for U.S. military interventions to come. Two main points of the Monroe Doctrine. One is that the European nations would not colonize on the American continent, and another that the United States would stay out of the affairs of other nations, including their wars. This was restated by Roosevelt with a new twist, that we would markedly interfere with what was going on in the Western Hemisphere. Testing the, quote, open door policy of 1899, Japan attacked Russia in 1904 when it felt that Russia's ambitions counteracted their own. In a brilliant attack, Japan destroyed Russia's naval fleet. Roosevelt sponsored a meeting between the two nations, and the result was the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. While Roosevelt met with Russian and Japanese leaders to negotiate peace, like I said before, he was a master negotiator. He was used all over the world to negotiate contracts and peace at this time. Roosevelt sent Taft to Tokyo to secure an agreement with Japan in which Japan disavowed any claim to the Philippines in return for the United States' recognition of Japanese control of Korea. So what they were saying is that Japan would allow us to, quote, have the territory of the Philippines and not have any claims there if we would in turn say that Japan had access to Korea. However, distrust reigned on both sides, and when the city of San Francisco ordered Asian students to attend segregated schools, Japan protested the action vigorously. Roosevelt forced the city school system to change its policy. At the same time, he finalized an agreement that Japan would no longer issue visas to the United States. So Roosevelt stepped in to make sure that the schools weren't segregated in San Francisco, but Japan at that same time said, we are not going to let any of our citizens immigrate to the United States. In 1905, Europe comes back into the picture with some more violence. Kaiser Wilhelm II brought the world to the precipice of war with some remarks that he made, but Roosevelt intervened and kept the peace among the aggrieved nations. He won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for his role in these European negotiations regarding trades and the independence in Morocco. So he was the first United States president to win a Nobel Peace Prize, but he was not the last. The capstone of Roosevelt's successes as president came in 1907 when he sent the entire Navy, dubbed the Great White Fleet, because it was painted white, it was in times of peace, across the globe, landing at every major port to show the might and strength of the United States. So that is the summary, a really quick summary of imperialism. We're going to talk a lot about this stuff in class, but now you've got a little bit of the what, so we can talk about the why. I've got this one really weird slide that I'm going to throw in here that is not going to feel like it fits with anything. But one of the state standards that we have to teach is Arizona history, and I am just going to give you one really quick slide on some of the facts that we need to address according to the standards, and it fits pretty well in here. We're just going to really quickly talk about Arizona becoming a state, which I'm doing this right now because it celebrates its birthday in the next week. Arizona became a state on February 14th, 1912. The soon-to-be governor of Arizona, George P. Hunt, watched President Taft sign the official document in Washington, D.C. on this date. Arizona had been asking for statehood since Abraham Lincoln was in office after the Gadsden Purchase and before the Civil War, but they'd not been able to have statehood until now. The people celebrated throughout the state. Fireworks and dancing were part of the spectacular event as well. They considered themselves as a people who would take care of themselves. They were very independent and tough to the core. A couple of other things that we have to talk about that are state standards are the ideas of initiative, referendum, and recall. These become important later when it comes to getting laws passed, and they are all three used inside the state of Arizona on how to get a law passed. The first is an initiative. An initiative is when a person or a group of people write and propose a law. They sign a petition, and they get enough people to sign it so that the state legislature is forced to vote on it. Referendum is when legislators put bills on ballots for the voters to decide. Instead of the legislators deciding, they have the people vote on it. And a recall is a petition by people to remove officers from office. They issue the recall. We say we want, I don't know, for example, Joe Arpaio to be recalled. That happened quite a few times. And then it's put on, and when they get enough petitions signed for that, if they get enough signatures, then it's put on the ballot for the people to vote on it. So we're going to talk about those a little bit more in class. I don't know if we're going to talk about them this week or next week, but we are going to talk about it some more. So I have a basic understanding of those. I know that's weird. That's just some state standard stuff that we have to talk about in this class that doesn't really fit anywhere else. That's it. So I want you to think about this quote from the text. Much of the conflict discussed in this chapter changed the world's view of the United States. We had previously been known throughout the world as the champion of freedom. There's an extra bracket in there. That first one's not supposed to be there. Now, in the false and un-American position of crushing with military force the efforts of our former allies to achieve liberty and self-government. Those that we had crushed at this point, we had stuck up for the Panamanians, who declared independence from Colombia. We fought in Cuba. We fought in the Philippines. We annexed Hawaii. This time of imperialism went against the first 100 years of our country's history and our philosophy on how to deal with foreign affairs and the Monroe Doctrine. So be prepared to talk about that in class and answer this question. When is force necessary to guarantee freedom? Have a great weekend, and I will see you next week.